December 24th, 1964. Somewhere above the Mekong Delta, Vietnam. Ground controllers would later struggle to explain what they witnessed through their radio static that Christmas Eve morning. A lumbering World War II transport plane, the kind built to carry paratroopers, not fight wars, circling at 1,000 feet like a predator. Below, American soldiers trapped in a Viet Cong ambush had been calling for air support for 3 hours. Every conventional fighter bomber had been turned away by the dense jungle canopy and the impossibility of precision strikes without hitting friendly forces. Military doctrine was clear. Close air support required fast jets, surgical strikes, and calculated risks that often meant acceptable casualties among your own men. The enemy knew this. They positioned themselves close to American positions, confident that no pilot would dare fire into such chaos. But Captain Paul Howie was not flying a conventional aircraft. Inside his modified C-47, 3 miniguns waited in the cargo bay, each capable of firing 100 rounds per second through the portside windows. As the aircraft began its slow, methodical orbit, tracers began pouring from the sky like liquid fire. Not random bursts, not scattered bombing runs. A precise, devastating curtain of lead that could differentiate between friend and foe with surgical accuracy. The Viet Cong had never seen anything like it. Neither had the Pentagon. This gunship would prove so devastatingly effective that the military brass would face an impossible question. What do you do with a weapon that works too well? The monsoon clouds hung low over Tan Son Nhut Air Base as Captain Paul Howie completed his pre-flight checklist in the dim cockpit light. Outside, the December humidity pressed against the metal skin of his C-47, the same type of aircraft that had dropped paratroopers over Normandy 20 years earlier. Tonight, however, this particular Skytrain carried modifications that would have baffled its original designers. 3 M134 miniguns mounted in the port cargo bay, their barrels protruding through hastily cut windows, represented the culmination of months of experimentation that had begun with a simple question. What if an aircraft could loiter over a battlefield and provide sustained firepower instead of making brief, high-speed passes? The radio crackled to life with the voice of ground control. Spooky 01, we have troops in contact at grid coordinates Whiskey Tango 4792, multiple casualties, immediate assistance required. Howie acknowledged the transmission and felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. Below in the cargo compartment, 3 airmen manned the miniguns, each weapon fed by linked belts of 7.62mm ammunition. The aircraft carried 24,000 rounds tonight, enough for sustained engagement that conventional fighters could never match. As the C-47 lifted off from the runway, Howie reflected on the skepticism he had encountered from his superiors. The concept of a gunship violated decades of accepted tactical doctrine. Air support meant speed, surprise, and rapid departure before enemy forces could respond effectively. The idea of a slow transport plane deliberately loitering over hostile territory seemed like suicide to most Air Force officers. Yet, the mathematics of sustained firepower told a different story. Where a jet fighter might deliver its ordnance in seconds before departing, the Spooky could remain on station for 6 hours, providing continuous suppression of enemy positions. 20 minutes later, Howie could see the muzzle flashes below illuminating the jungle canopy near Tran Yend. American forces had established a defensive perimeter around a small outpost, but Viet Cong fighters had infiltrated close enough to make traditional airstrikes impossible. Any bombs or rockets would likely kill as many friendlies as enemies. The situation demanded precision that only came from human eyes and controlled bursts of fire. Spooky 01, this is Groundhog 6, came the desperate voice of the ground commander. We are taking heavy fire from 3 sides. Estimate company strength enemy force with automatic weapons. We have wounded that need immediate extraction, but cannot establish landing zone under current conditions. Howie banked the aircraft into a left turn, beginning the pylon turn that would keep the port side guns oriented toward the target area. At 150 miles per hour and 1,000 feet altitude, the C-47 presented a stable firing platform that allowed the gunners to engage specific targets rather than saturating entire areas. Groundhog 6, Spooky 01 beginning gun run. Mark your positions with strobes and stay low. The first burst from the lead minigun sent a stream of tracers into the jungle, each gun capable of firing between 50 and 100 rounds per second, depending on the selected rate. The sound was unlike anything heard in previous conflicts, a continuous roar that seemed to tear the air itself. Through his headset, Howie could hear the gunners calling out targets as they adjusted their fire based on ground controller directions and observed results. "Good hits on the tree line, Spooky," reported the ground commander. "Enemy fire has decreased significantly from the north side. Can you shift to bearing 090 degrees from our position?" The aircraft completed another orbit, and the miniguns engaged a new target area. The precision was remarkable. Experienced gunners could place fire within meters of friendly positions, creating a protective barrier that conventional weapons could never achieve. Each M134 weighed 85 pounds and consumed ammunition at a rate that would have been impossible to sustain without the aircraft's ability to carry massive quantities of linked rounds. As the engagement continued, Howie monitored fuel consumption and ammunition expenditure. The C-47 carried 300 gallons of fuel, providing the endurance that made sustained operations possible. Unlike jet fighters that measured their time over target in minutes, the Spooky could remain engaged for hours if necessary. This fundamental difference in operational capability represented a revolution in close air support doctrine, though few senior officers yet grasped its implications. "Spooky 01, enemy fire has ceased from all positions," came the report from below. "We are beginning casualty evacuation procedures. Your fire was right on target. Outstanding work." After 90 minutes over the target area, the Spooky had expended 4,500 rounds of ammunition. The ground commander reported that Viet Cong forces had withdrawn, leaving behind weapons and equipment that suggested significant casualties. More importantly, the American outpost remained intact, and wounded personnel were being evacuated under the protection of the orbiting gunship. As Howie turned the aircraft back toward Tan Son Nhut, he considered the night's success in the context of broader tactical possibilities. The AC-47 had demonstrated capabilities that extended far beyond what anyone had anticipated during its development. The ability to provide sustained, accurate fire while maintaining station over friendly forces opened possibilities that challenged fundamental assumptions about air-ground coordination. Back at base, the post-mission debriefing drew attention from officers who had initially dismissed the gunship concept. The precise application of firepower, the duration of engagement, and the tactical flexibility demonstrated that night represented something genuinely new in military aviation. However, Howie also sensed undercurrents of concern among senior leaders who worried about the implications of such overwhelming firepower in the hands of individual aircraft commanders. The success at Tran Yen marked the beginning of operational validation for a concept that would soon spread throughout Southeast Asia. Yet it also raised questions that would ultimately prove more challenging than the technical problems of mounting miniguns in transport aircraft. How much firepower was appropriate for close air support? What were the implications of aircraft that could dominate battlefields in ways that no single weapon system had ever achieved? These questions would soon move from theoretical discussions to urgent policy debates as the Spooky's effectiveness became impossible to ignore. The morning briefing at Tan Son Nhut on December 23rd revealed the extent of skepticism that still pervaded the upper echelons of Air Force Command. Colonel James Mitchell, operations officer for the 7th Air Force, studied the after-action report from Tran Yen with the measured caution of a career officer who had seen promising innovations fail under the pressure of sustained operations. The success of a single mission, however dramatic, did not constitute proof of concept for a weapon system that challenged decades of established doctrine. "Captain Howie," Mitchell began, his voice carrying the weight of institutional doubt, "your report indicates exceptional results, but we need to understand whether this represents a repeatable capability or simply favorable circumstances. The enemy was caught off guard. They had no time to adapt their tactics or bring anti-aircraft weapons into position. We cannot base operational decisions on a single engagement, regardless of its apparent success." Howie understood the colonel's concerns, but he also recognized the opportunity that lay before them. The AC-47 represented more than just another weapon system. It embodied a fundamental shift in how air power could be applied to ground combat. The ability to maintain continuous fire for hours rather than minutes created tactical possibilities that had never existed in previous conflicts. Sir, I request permission to conduct additional test missions over the next 72 hours. We need to evaluate performance against prepared positions, assess vulnerability to ground fire, and determine optimal tactics for sustained operations. The approval came with strict limitations. Each mission would be carefully monitored, with detailed analysis of ammunition expenditure, fuel consumption, and tactical effectiveness. More importantly, the aircraft would operate under close supervision, with abort criteria that prioritized crew safety over mission completion. The Air Force could not afford to lose aircrew to an experimental weapons system, regardless of its potential benefits. On the night of December 24th, the Spooky received its second combat assignment. Intelligence reports indicated a Viet Cong company had established positions around a special forces camp near the Cambodian border, with the apparent intention of launching a coordinated assault during Christmas morning. Unlike the previous engagement, this enemy force had time to prepare defensive positions and potentially deploy weapons capable of engaging low-flying aircraft. Lieutenant Colonel Richard Kinnard accompanied Howie on the mission, ostensibly as an observer, but actually as a senior officer capable of making real-time decisions about the continuation of the Gunship program. If the AC-47 proved vulnerable to prepared defenses, the experiment would end immediately. The stakes extended beyond a single aircraft and crew. They encompassed the future of close air support doctrine and the credibility of officers who had advocated for unconventional approaches to aerial warfare. As the C-47 approached the target area, ground controllers reported intense preparations for what appeared to be a major assault. Enemy forces had moved closer to the perimeter during darkness, and conventional airstrikes remained impossible due to the proximity of hostile and friendly positions. The Special Forces team requested immediate assistance, emphasizing that their defensive positions could not withstand a coordinated attack without external fire support. Howie initiated the standard pylon turn at 1,000 feet, beginning the orbit that would bring the miniguns to bear on suspected enemy positions. The first burst revealed the difference between this engagement and the previous night's success. Muzzle flashes immediately appeared from multiple locations as Viet Cong forces returned fire with automatic weapons and what appeared to be a heavy machine gun. Tracers arced upward through the darkness, some passing close enough to the aircraft that Kinnard could see them through the cockpit windows. "Taking ground fire from multiple positions," reported the lead gunner. "Adjusting point of aim to suppress anti-aircraft positions first." The tactical modification demonstrated the crew's growing understanding of how to employ the weapon system effectively. Rather than engaging all targets simultaneously, they prioritized threats to the aircraft itself, then expanded their fire to support the ground forces. The engagement lasted 3 hours, during which the Spooky expended over 6,000 rounds while maintaining continuous station over the target area. Despite the intensity of ground fire, the aircraft's altitude and speed provided sufficient protection from small arms, while the miniguns systematically eliminated each source of enemy fire. By dawn, the Viet Cong assault had been abandoned, with intelligence reports later confirming significant casualties among the attacking force. Kinnard's assessment proved crucial to the program's continuation. His report emphasized not only the tactical success, but also the psychological impact on both friendly and enemy forces. American troops reported unprecedented confidence in their ability to defend positions when supported by the gunship, while captured documents revealed that Viet Cong commanders were already developing new tactics to counter the aircraft's capabilities. The third test mission on December 26th presented different challenges. Intelligence indicated that enemy forces had begun positioning heavy machine guns, specifically to engage the orbiting gunship, having learned from the previous encounters that the aircraft followed predictable flight patterns. This adaptation represented the first indication that the Spooky's effectiveness might diminish as enemy forces developed countermeasures. Captain Howie modified his approach, varying altitude between 800 and 1,200 feet, and altering the size of his orbit to present a less predictable target. The miniguns engaged suspected anti-aircraft positions with concentrated fire before expanding to other targets, demonstrating the tactical flexibility that would become characteristic of gunship operations. Despite increased enemy preparation, the mission achieved its objectives with no damage to the aircraft. The psychological impact extended beyond immediate tactical results. Ground commanders throughout the Mekong Delta began requesting gunship support for operations that had previously been considered too risky or difficult to execute. The knowledge that sustained, accurate fire support was available changed planning assumptions and operational possibilities in ways that surprised even the aircraft's advocates. However, the success also generated unexpected resistance within the Air Force hierarchy. Some senior officers expressed concern that reliance on such overwhelming firepower might create tactical dependencies that would prove problematic if the weapons were not available. Others worried about the precedent of individual aircraft wielding such decisive influence over ground combat, arguing that it represented an unhealthy concentration of capability in single platforms that could be lost to enemy action or mechanical failure. By December 27th, the test program had generated enough data to support preliminary conclusions about the AC-47's operational utility. The aircraft had demonstrated remarkable effectiveness in close air support roles, with precision and endurance that exceeded all expectations. Yet it had also revealed the discomforting reality that such concentrated firepower could fundamentally alter the balance of ground combat in ways that made traditional military leaders deeply uncomfortable. By January 1965, the success of the test missions had generated momentum that proved difficult for Air Force leadership to ignore. Requests for gunship support flooded operations centers throughout South Vietnam as word spread among ground commanders about the AC-47's capabilities. The aircraft that had been dismissed as an experimental curiosity just weeks earlier was now being hailed as a revolutionary advancement in close air support doctrine. Yet this enthusiasm from field commanders created exactly the kind of institutional pressure that made senior Pentagon officials deeply uncomfortable. The transformation became visible in the radio chatter that accompanied each mission. Ground troops who had previously accepted that air support meant brief, violent engagements followed by long periods of vulnerability now spoke with confidence about holding positions that would have been abandoned under conventional circumstances. The call sign, "Puff the Magic Dragon," emerged from this new reality, coined by soldiers who watched the aircraft's tracers illuminate the night sky like the fire-breathing dragon from the popular song. The nickname reflected not just the visual spectacle, but the almost mythical status the gunship was acquiring among infantry units. Staff Sergeant Tom Peterson experienced this transformation firsthand during a reconnaissance patrol that went wrong in the jungle west of Saigon. His 12-man Special Forces team had been tracking a suspected Viet Cong supply route when they stumbled into a company-sized enemy force that had been moving through the same area. Conventional wisdom dictated that such a small unit would attempt to disengage and call for extraction when faced with overwhelming numbers. Instead, Peterson found himself coordinating with an orbiting AC-47 that could provide the sustained firepower necessary to not only survive the encounter, but actually complete their original mission. "Puff 2-1, this is Blackfoot 6. Peterson spoke into his radio as enemy fire crackled through the vegetation around his position. "We are in contact with approximately 60 enemy personnel. They have us surrounded, but we can mark our position with strobes. Can you give us some breathing room?" The response came immediately, accompanied by the distinctive sound of miniguns spinning up to firing speed. Within minutes, the concentrated fire had broken the encirclement and allowed Peterson's team to maneuver against the now disrupted enemy force. The tactical implications extended far beyond individual engagements. Intelligence analysts noted that Viet Cong units were beginning to avoid areas where gunship support was available, effectively ceding control of significant territory during nighttime hours when the AC-47 was most effective. This shift represented a strategic advantage that had emerged from what was initially conceived as a tactical innovation. The presence of a single aircraft was influencing enemy decision-making across entire provinces. However, the gunship's growing reputation also attracted attention from officers who viewed its effectiveness with suspicion rather than enthusiasm. Lieutenant Colonel William Hayes, a staff officer assigned to the Pentagon's Office of Systems Analysis, began compiling reports about the AC-47's operations with particular focus on what he termed disproportionate effects. His analysis suggested that individual aircraft commanders were wielding influence over ground operations that exceeded appropriate levels for their rank and position within the command structure. Hayes's concerns reflected deeper institutional anxieties about the changing nature of warfare in Vietnam. The conflict had already challenged traditional military doctrine through its emphasis on counterinsurgency operations and unconventional tactics. The introduction of weapons systems that could single-handedly determine the outcome of significant engagements represented another departure from established patterns of command and control. Senior leaders worried about the precedent of investing such decisive capability in individual platforms that operated with considerable autonomy. These concerns crystallized during a meeting at the Pentagon in late January, where General Curtis LeMay, Air Force Chief of Staff, reviewed operational reports from Vietnam with his senior staff. The AC-47's success rate was undeniable, but LeMay expressed reservations about the broader implications of the gunship concept. "We are creating a situation where ground commanders expect miraculous intervention from individual aircraft," he observed. "What happens when those aircraft are not available? Are we building tactical dependencies that will prove catastrophic under different circumstances?" The debate extended beyond immediate tactical considerations to fundamental questions about the nature of American military power. The gunship represented concentrated firepower that could be applied with precision and duration that had never been possible in previous conflicts. Yet this capability also meant that individual crews were making split-second decisions that could determine the survival of entire units. The traditional hierarchy of military decision-making was being compressed into the cockpit of a modified transport aircraft. Captain Howie found himself at the center of these institutional tensions during a briefing at 7th Air Force headquarters. Senior officers peppered him with questions that revealed their discomfort with the gunship's effectiveness. How could commanders plan operations when the availability of a single aircraft could determine success or failure? What were the implications of tactics that depended on weapon systems that existed in extremely limited numbers? The questions revealed a fundamental disconnect between the realities of combat in Vietnam and the institutional preferences of a military establishment built around different assumptions. The operational tempo continued to increase despite these concerns. By February, the single AC-47 was flying almost nightly missions, with demand far exceeding availability. Maintenance crews worked around the clock to keep the aircraft operational, while ammunition consumption reached levels that strained supply chains designed for conventional weapons. Each successful mission generated additional requests for support, creating a cycle of demand that could not be sustained with existing resources. The psychological impact on enemy forces became increasingly apparent through intelligence reports and captured documents. Viet Cong commanders issued directives specifically addressing tactics for avoiding engagement with the gunship, acknowledging its decisive effects on ground combat. Some units reportedly refused to operate in areas where AC-47 support was likely to be available, representing a strategic victory that extended far beyond the aircraft's actual operational radius. Yet this success also highlighted the weapon's potential for creating unintended consequences. Ground commanders who had become accustomed to gunship support began taking risks that would have been unthinkable under previous circumstances. Small units ventured into hostile territory with confidence that PUF could extract them from any situation, creating tactical dependencies that worried senior leaders who understood that the single aircraft could not be everywhere simultaneously. The institutional pressure reached a turning point in March, when General William Westmoreland, commander of Military Assistance Command Vietnam, requested a formal assessment of the gunship program. His directive specifically asked whether the AC-47 represented a tactical innovation that should be expanded or a dangerous departure from sound military doctrine that needed to be controlled. The assessment would determine not only the future of the existing aircraft, but also whether similar weapons would be developed and deployed throughout Southeast Asia. The stage was set for a confrontation between field effectiveness and institutional preference, between the undeniable tactical success of an innovative weapon and the institutional resistance of a military establishment that valued predictability over revolutionary capability. The Pentagon briefing room fell silent as General William Westmoreland reviewed the classified assessment that would determine the AC-47's fate. The document, compiled over 6 weeks of intensive analysis, contained operational data that painted a picture of unprecedented tactical success coupled with institutional concerns that reached the highest levels of military leadership. Westmoreland's decision would affect not only the immediate future of gunship operations, but also the broader question of how rapidly the American military could adapt to unconventional warfare in Southeast Asia. The statistics were undeniable. In 4 months of operations, the single AC-47 had conducted over 100 combat missions with a success rate that exceeded 95%. Enemy forces had been forced to abandon planned attacks in dozens of instances, while American casualties in areas where gunship support was available had dropped by more than 60%. Yet these same numbers revealed what senior officers viewed as a dangerous dependency on a single weapon system that operated outside traditional command structures and tactical doctrine. Colonel Mitchell presented the case for restriction during the March briefing, his arguments reflecting concerns that had been building within Air Force leadership since the first reports of the gunship's effectiveness. The AC-47 has created tactical expectations that cannot be sustained with current resources, he argued. Ground commanders are planning operations based on the assumption that this level of fire support will be available, but we have only one aircraft. What happens when maintenance issues or combat damage removes that capability? We risk catastrophic failures because we have allowed tactical planning to become dependent on a resource that exists in extremely limited quantities. The institutional concerns extended beyond simple resource limitations to fundamental questions about the nature of American military doctrine in Vietnam. The gunship's effectiveness had created a psychological transformation among ground forces that worried senior leaders who understood that warfare required more than technological solutions. Soldiers, who had once approached dangerous missions with appropriate caution, now displayed confidence that bordered on recklessness, secure in their belief that Puff could extract them from any situation. Lieutenant Colonel Kinnard found himself defending not only the gunship's tactical utility, but also its broader strategic implications during heated discussions with Pentagon staff officers. The AC-47 has demonstrated capabilities that extend beyond individual engagements, he argued. Enemy forces are modifying their entire operational approach to avoid confrontation with the gunship. We are achieving strategic effects through tactical innovation, forcing the Viet Cong to abandon territory and modify their tactics in ways that benefit our overall campaign objectives. However, the counter-arguments carried weight that could not be dismissed through tactical success alone. The concentration of such decisive firepower in individual aircraft represented a departure from military doctrine that emphasized distributed capabilities and redundant systems. Senior officers worried about the precedent of weapons that could single-handedly determine the outcome of significant engagements, arguing that such concentrated capability created vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit through focused attacks on critical assets. The debate reached its climax during a classified session where intelligence analysts presented evidence of enemy adaptation to the gunship's presence. Viet Cong units had begun deploying heavy machine guns and even captured anti-aircraft weapons specifically to engage orbiting AC-47s. More concerning, intercepted communications revealed that enemy commanders were developing tactics designed to exploit the psychological dependency that American forces had developed on gunship support. General Westmoreland's concerns focused on what he termed the artificial nature of tactical success that depended on overwhelming technological advantages. His experience in conventional warfare had taught him that sustainable military success required approaches that could be maintained over extended periods without creating dependencies on limited resources. The AC-47's effectiveness, while impressive in the short term, represented exactly the kind of technological solution that could create long-term vulnerabilities if enemy forces developed effective countermeasures. The final argument against continued unrestricted use came from an unexpected source. Captain Howie himself acknowledged during testimony that the gunship's success was creating unrealistic expectations among ground commanders who did not fully understand the weapon's limitations. "I have observed increasing willingness among ground units to accept risks that they would never have considered without gunship support," he admitted. While this confidence has led to tactical successes, it also represents a fundamental change in how American forces approach combat operations in Vietnam. The decision, when it came, reflected the institutional preference for measured approaches over revolutionary innovation. Westmoreland ordered significant restrictions on AC-47 operations, limiting the aircraft to specific types of missions that would demonstrate its capabilities without creating the tactical dependencies that worried senior leaders. The gunship would continue to operate, but under constraints designed to prevent ground forces from becoming overly reliant on its unique capabilities. The restrictions proved more severe than advocates had anticipated. The AC-47 was prohibited from providing routine support for patrol operations, limited to emergency response situations where conventional air support was unavailable or ineffective. More significantly, the aircraft could not be used in situations where its absence might compromise mission success, effectively eliminating its role in offensive operations that depended on sustained fire support. These limitations had immediate tactical consequences that validated both supporters' and critics' arguments. Ground commanders who had planned operations around gunship availability were forced to adopt more conservative approaches, leading to missed opportunities and increased American casualties in some situations. However, the restrictions also forced the development of tactical approaches that did not depend on overwhelming firepower, potentially creating more sustainable long-term capabilities. The psychological impact on American forces proved more complex than either side had anticipated. While some units experienced decreased confidence due to reduced gunship availability, others developed enhanced tactical proficiency as they adapted to operations without guaranteed fire support. The mixed results highlighted the difficulty of assessing the true impact of revolutionary weapons on military effectiveness and morale. Enemy forces responded to the restrictions with increased aggressiveness, testing American positions that had previously been considered secure due to potential gunship intervention. Intelligence reports indicated that Viet Cong commanders were specifically targeting areas where AC-47 support was unlikely, demonstrating their understanding of the tactical changes created by the weapon's limitations. The debate over gunship employment reflected broader tensions within the American military establishment between innovation and institutional stability. The AC-47 had proven that individual weapons could achieve strategic effects through tactical application, but it had also demonstrated the institutional challenges created by revolutionary capabilities that operated outside established doctrine and command structures. By mid-1965, the restrictions had effectively ended the AC-47's role as a decisive factor in ground combat operations. The aircraft continued to fly missions, but under limitations that prevented it from achieving the kind of dramatic tactical successes that had initially generated such enthusiasm among ground forces and concern among senior leaders. 23 years after the restrictions ended, the AC-47's revolutionary impact in Vietnam, Staff Sergeant Tom Peterson sat in his modest apartment in Columbus, Ohio, sorting through photographs and documents that captured fragments of a war that had changed him in ways he was still discovering. The morning light filtered through Venetian blinds, illuminating images of jungle clearings and fire-base perimeters where the distinctive sound of miniguns had once provided salvation for American troops caught in impossible situations. Peterson's hands, weathered by decades of civilian work as a construction supervisor, handled the photographs with the careful reverence reserved for sacred relics. The irony was not lost on him that the weapon system, which had been deemed too powerful for sustained combat use, had evolved into the foundation of American close air support doctrine in the decades following Vietnam. The AC-130 Spectre, which emerged in the 1970s, carried forward the legacy of Puff the Magic Dragon with enhanced firepower that included 20mm cannons and even larger weapon systems. The institutional resistance that had limited the AC-47's employment had gradually given way to recognition that concentrated aerial firepower represented a legitimate and necessary component of modern warfare. Peterson's reflections were interrupted by a telephone call from a documentary filmmaker researching the early days of gunship operations. The conversation inevitably led to questions about the psychological impact of the restrictions, the sense among ground forces that a life-saving capability had been arbitrarily removed by officers who had never experienced the terror of being surrounded by enemy forces in the darkness of a Southeast Asian jungle. "You have to understand," Peterson explained, his voice carrying the weight of decades spent processing those memories. "It wasn't just about the firepower. It was about knowing that someone was watching over you, that you weren't alone out there." The filmmaker's questions prompted Peterson to retrieve a letter he had written but never sent to General Westmoreland in 1966, expressing his unit's frustration with the decision to restrict AC-47 operations. The letter, yellowed with age and written in the careful script of a young soldier trying to articulate complex emotions, captured the sense of betrayal felt by troops who had experienced the security that came with gunship support. "The brass never understood that it changed how we thought about impossible situations," the letter read. "With Puff overhead, we could accomplish missions that would have been suicide under normal circumstances." The evolution of gunship doctrine in the post-Vietnam era had vindicated many of the tactical innovations that had been suppressed during the conflict itself. Special operations. Command had embraced the concept of concentrated aerial firepower, developing aircraft and tactics that reflected the lessons learned from the AC-47's brief period of unrestricted operations. The psychological effects that had worried Pentagon officials in 1965 were now recognized as legitimate force multipliers that enhanced the effectiveness of ground operations when properly integrated into overall tactical planning. Captain Paul Howie, who had retired as a colonel after a distinguished career that included significant contributions to the development of the AC-130 program, maintained contact with Peterson and other veterans who had experienced the early days of gunship operations. Their occasional reunions inevitably included discussions about the might-have-beens, the strategic opportunities that were lost when institutional caution overcame tactical innovation. Howie's perspective had evolved over the years, incorporating an understanding of the legitimate concerns that had motivated the restrictions while maintaining his belief that the AC-47's potential had never been fully realized. The broader implications of the gunship's restricted use became apparent as military historians analyzed the overall effectiveness of American air power in Vietnam. Studies conducted in the 1980s revealed that concentrated, sustained firepower had proven more effective at disrupting enemy operations than the dispersed applications favored by conventional doctrine. The AC-47's brief period of unrestricted use had generated tactical successes that exceeded those achieved by much larger investments in traditional air support systems. Pentagon analysts who reviewed classified documents decades later acknowledged that the institutional resistance to the gunship concept had reflected broader difficulties in adapting to unconventional warfare. The military establishment's preference for distributed capabilities and traditional command structures had prevented full exploitation of innovations that were specifically suited to the counterinsurgency environment of Southeast Asia. The AC-47's restrictions represented a missed opportunity to develop tactical approaches that might have achieved strategic objectives more efficiently than conventional methods. The human cost of these decisions remained difficult to quantify, but veterans like Peterson carried personal knowledge of engagements that might have concluded differently with unrestricted gunship support. His unit's casualties had increased significantly after the AC-47's role was limited, a pattern repeated throughout American forces as ground commanders were forced to rely on conventional air support that lacked the precision and endurance that had made the gunship so effective. The technological legacy proved more durable than the tactical applications that had been suppressed in Vietnam. Defense contractors incorporated lessons learned from AC-47 operations into the design of subsequent aircraft, leading to gunships that carried heavier weapons and more sophisticated sensors, while maintaining the fundamental concept of concentrated firepower delivered from orbiting platforms. The institutional acceptance of these later systems reflected changed attitudes toward unconventional weapons that had been shaped by decades of experience with conflicts that did not conform to traditional patterns. Peterson's reflections on the gunship's legacy inevitably returned to the personal relationships that had been forged under the protection of puffs covering fire. The shared experience of surviving situations that would have been hopeless without the AC-47's intervention had created bonds that endured long after the war's end. Veterans who had served in different units during different periods often found common ground in their memories of the distinctive sound of miniguns and the psychological comfort that came with knowing that overwhelming firepower was available when needed. The strategic implications of the AC-47's restricted use extended beyond immediate tactical consequences to broader questions about military innovation and institutional adaptation. The weapon system that had been deemed too powerful for sustained combat use had actually represented a preview of warfare's future direction, where precision firepower and advanced technology would provide decisive advantages to forces that could effectively integrate new capabilities into their tactical approaches. As Peterson returned the photographs to their storage box, he reflected on the paradox that had defined his generation's experience with military innovation. The same institutional caution that had limited the AC-47's effectiveness had also preserved the lives and careers of senior officers who understood that revolutionary weapons carried risks as well as opportunities. The balance between innovation and stability remained as relevant in contemporary military planning as it had been during the early days of gunship operations over the jungles of Vietnam.